This is a story 200 years in the making. The story of a village that became a town. A town that became a city, rich in colonial heritage. The people who made it, the good times and the bad. In the heart of the southern tablelands of New South Wales, Australia's first inland city. This is the story of Goulburn. When European explorers ventured into what they called the Goulburn Plains in 1820, it was the home of the Gandangara and Ngunnawal people. Gandangara to the north, the Ngunnawal to the south, living a traditional Aboriginal lifestyle.
They moved from location to location. However, it is well documented that throughout this area, when the colonials first and the white people first came, they acknowledged that right across these plains behind us, there were significant grasslands, grasslands where there was no bush, there was no great forestation areas. It was just significant grasslands, which we believe had been set up by the traditional custodians as a great place to actually come and eat and feast.
Rocky Hill was a meeting place for men. The banks of the Wollondilly River, where the Waterworks Museum now stands, was a traditional women's area. And the site of the Goulburn railway station was a major meeting place in summer, especially around bogong moth season. The Ngunnawal and Gandangara people were joined by the Yuin from the south coast and the Wiradjuri from the northwest. Places familiar to the First Nations people are still familiar to us today.
Mulwaree means long water, so we're standing here straight above the Mulwaree Ponds, which runs straight through to the Wollondilly River. Wollondilly is again Aboriginal word, Goulburn Mulwaree Council Mulwaree is the traditional name of this area in our own language, in Ngunnawal and Gandangara language.
This is quite likely what the first Europeans known to have visited the region would have seen. An expedition led by ex-convict John Wilson in 1798 reached Marulan and Mount Towrang, about 10 kilometres east of present-day Goulburn. After reports by explorer Hamilton Hume of rich, well-grassed black soil plains of the southern tablelands, Deputy Surveyor General James Meehan was sent by Governor Macquarie to survey and lay out a road to the port of Jervis Bay. From a site now called Mount Meehan near Turana, 11 kilometres south of Goulburn, this is what they saw. But this is as close as they came to where Goulburn would be established. It was Meehan who recommended that the grasslands be named Goulburn Plains after Henry Goulburn, the Under-Secretary of War and the colonies. 2 years later, Governor Macquarie personally led an expedition to what he called the New Country, camping on the eastern side of the Mulwaree River.
But they came down and they came to the Wollondilly, they crossed the Wollondilly at what we now know as Kenmore, and then they came up and they came to the meeting of the two rivers, which is the Wollondilly is met by the Mulwaree River, which is this river which is behind us. So they then followed the Mulwaree River on this side, which is important, on the east side of the Mulwaree River, and they rode up here and they set up camp somewhere around over here at around where now the Lansdowne Bridge is. And he wrote effusively about the wonder of this Mulwaree Plains, which extended, forever, this treeless plain, which was obviously so good. All they were doing was looking for land, looking for somewhere that they could have cattle coming.
Macquarie later officially agreed to Meehan's suggestion that the area be called Goulburn Plains and the county to be known as Argyll, in honour of his native county in Scotland. But he never suggested a township be established here. In fact, he never actually set foot on what we now know as Goulburn. What Governor Macquarie did was to officially open up the land for farming and grazing. Within a year, pastoral properties were being established: wheat, barley, potatoes and gardens, and livestock including 4,000 head of cattle and 6,000 sheep. But for the new settlement, it was an unconvincing start. Originally, the town was planned to be built here, where North Goulburn now stands, but it was relocated southwest because the Wallandilly River crossing was flood prone. And then there was a proposal by the Colonial Secretary Alexander Macleay to call it Lorne, because there were too many localities called Goulburn. A sympathetic Presbyterian minister and historian, Dr. John Dunmore Lang, summed it up this way: "I hate you Goulburn Downs and Goulburn Plains, and Goulburn River, the Goulburn Range, and Mount Goulburn and Goulburn Plains. One's brains are turned with Goulburns." The new governor, Sir Richard Burke, agreed to move the settlement, but he ordered that the name Goulburn be retained. Within a decade, there are at least 20 pastoral properties in the district: Springfield, Rosseville, Lansdowne, Strathallan and Turana among them. For some years, relations with the Gandangara were tense and sometimes violent. Stockmen were accused of abducting Aboriginal girls, provoking retaliation. Aboriginal hunting grounds became farms, traditional food sources diminished. As early as the 1830s, colonial surveyor William Govert reported, "The kangaroos have either been killed or have fled in search of more retired forests. Sheep and cattle have taken their place. The emu and turkey are seldom seen. The millions of parrots have even become scarce." Within a few short years of the arrival of the European settlers, the number of Aborigines rapidly diminished. It wasn't just the loss of their traditional way of life and resources, they also fell victim to the white man's diseases, a smallpox epidemic in the 1830s, influenza in the mid-40s, and measles in the 1860s. By then, official reports suggested there was no evidence of Aboriginal people in the Goulburn Plains, but they were there and still are. According to the Bureau of Statistics, almost 5% of Goulburn's current population are Indigenous.
Most of them were actually assimilated and in some way, shape or form into the growing Australian community of the time. Australia was built on the fact that we had a huge amount of convict settlement, most of whom were males. Many of those males went on to meet and partner up with Aboriginal women, and so we had women, children who had an Aboriginal parent and a white parent. So at the time, they weren't counted as Aboriginal because they weren't full-blood Aboriginal.
It wasn't until 1833 that the town of Goulburn was officially surveyed by Robert Hoddle. Hoddle Avenue, not far from the Goulburn Base Hospital, is a lasting reminder of his service. In 1825, on the site of what is now the Police Academy, Andrew Allen was given a land grant and established the property Strathallan. And where the National Trust-owned heritage-listed Riversdale now stands, Matt Healy built a public house in 1828. It was described as a licensed shanty, selling colonial Jamaica rum and barley brie, strong brewed whiskey or ale. All that remains is the stable, the first stone building constructed in what was then known as the Old Township. Now it's a living museum of the era. Tradition has it that the district's first Roman Catholic Mass was celebrated in these stables. A year later, law and order arrived. Justice was primitive, harsh and swift. A whipping post stood outside the rough timber courthouse, and there were rough conditions for the mounted police. They lived in barracks with a bark roof. But according to recent research, that was one of the main reasons for the establishment of Goulburn.
Yeah, you could really say that Goulburn is the only town in Australia that was founded by a bushranger and police.
Historian Roger Bailey says recently discovered letters uncovered evidence that local landowners pressed the government to establish a police garrison because of an outbreak of bushranging activity.
The local magistrates had written to the governor requesting that he build a courthouse, a jail and a police garrison. The first police arrived here in 1828 and went hunting for a gang of bushrangers called the Tenant Gang, who had the motto "Liberty or Death" carved into their gun butts.
Behind the walls of the old police station, 23 prisoners met their maker on the gallows, but it wasn't always discreet.
The first hanging on Gallows Hill in 1832 was like a public event. It was the best entertainment in town. There was only a couple of hundred people lived in the town, but 400 people turned up for the execution. There was a a brass band, there was a bloke selling pies, you know, it was a big event.
Bushrangers and murderers were among those who went to the gallows, but 2 of them were women, both of whom murdered their husbands.
The best known case was a gentle, refined housewife who had a husband who was a gambler, a drinker and a womaniser. He came home and told her that he gambled away the family farm. She was peeling the vegetables at the time. She shoved the knife in between his ribs. He died, and she was 8 months pregnant at the time. By the time she was hanged, the legend goes, she handed over a baby to the chief jail warder's wife before she mounted the steps to the gallows. The entire town was festooned with black crape because everyone was sympathetic towards Marianne Brownlow.
What was once Goulburn's jail and courthouse is now a book emporium, housing literally hundreds of thousands of books. The old cells, still with their steel doors and barred windows, is where you might find crime novels rather than criminals. Hard labour was behind the decision to build perhaps the Goulburn district's most famous prison, the Towrang Stockade. Built in 1833, 10 kilometres north of Goulburn, it was established to provide convict labour to build the Great South Road to link Sydney to the Goulburn district and beyond. As traffic thunders past on the busy Hume Highway, there are elegant reminders of the road built by convicts. Culverts crossing creek beds are still in largely good condition, almost 200 years after they were constructed by the convicts. The stockade is said to have housed up to 250 prisoners, the largest of the convict road gangs in southern New South Wales. Lifers and prisoners serving 14 years or more were marched to and from work in heavy irons guarded by soldiers with fixed bayonets. The stockade was in operation for just 10 years. Today the site is heritage listed, but nothing remains of the high timber fence that was the stockade itself, just a fenced off area where it once stood. But there are some reminders. The powder magazine dug into the embankment above the Wollondilly River was used to store blasting powder. Its entrance was restored in 1975, but inside it remains as it was. And below the stockade, a cemetery where soldiers and convicts alike were buried. Today, only 3 headstones remain, those of a soldier, a woman and a 4-year-old child. Goulburn's history of law and order continues to this day. This is SuperMax. Behind its heritage-listed stone and brick facade built in 1884 is the state's most secure prison, now housing convicted murderers and terrorists. From the earliest days of white settlement to today, the justice system has played an important role in Goulburn. Between them, the SuperMax prison and the police academy are among the city's biggest employers. But the gem in the crown of Goulburn's heritage-listed buildings is this one, the third and current courthouse. Built in the 1880s, it was a statement about Goulburn's wealth and prosperity, or as the state's Heritage Register puts it, embodied the coming of age of the town, and an extravagance never to be repeated. It could also have been our first national parliament. In 1899, there was an ambitious push to make Goulburn the nation's new federal capital, and the courthouse would have been the temporary home of the nation's parliament. A public meeting, said to be the largest public meeting ever held in the city, was held to advance Goulburn's claims. Goulburn was one of 45 sites put forward and one of 13 inspected. Although it had strong local backing, there was little support elsewhere, and Goulburn failed to make the shortlist. Initially, growth in Goulburn was slow. In 1841, the population was just 655, men outnumbering women 2 to 1. To help balance the numbers, Carolyn Chisholm, known as the immigrant's friend, was literally carting women from Sydney to colonial settlements like Goulburn, where her work and her story have been embraced. A mural in the Carolyn Chisholm Court in the council precinct depicts her helping immigrant women, described as coming from the humbler walks of life, to settle quickly and comfortably in colonial life. The Clifford Street immigration barracks, where she housed them before sending them to carefully selected farms, has long since been demolished. All that remains is a preserved section of the wall and a plaque in the grounds of the Burke Street Primary School. And in St Peter and Paul's Catholic Cathedral, a stained glass window also recalls her humanitarian work, although its artistic merits strongly divide the community. Life for young women in rural Goulburn became the fodder for an international bestseller. In 1898, 18-year-old Miles Franklin turned her experience growing up on a dairy farm southwest of Goulburn as the basis for her classic novel, My Brilliant Career. It was Goulburn Evening Penny Post editor Thomas Hebblewhite who encouraged the aspiring writer to write about what she knew.
She used the circumstances of the drought-stricken dairy farm, put that into her novel, My Brilliant Career. She took the circumstances of visiting her grandmother in the Brindabellas and living the life of luxury. That went into the novel. And so in that sense, it is very much about its time.
At the time of the publication of Miles Franklin's novel, a meeting was being held at the town hall by 150 women that would change the lives of women throughout Australia. The Suffragette Movement, the campaign for women to vote in public elections. In 1901, Goulburn formed the first branch of a suffrage league outside a capital city. In just 4 days, they collected 1,000 signatures for a petition to Parliament demanding the vote for women. It was the Goulburn that Miles Franklin had been writing about.
The book My Brilliant Career is really a stridently feminist book, although it was written over 100 years ago. It's very much about a woman's right to have her own life, to have her own career, and not be ruled by a husband. And so it was a strongly feminist novel, and I thought that would hit Goulburn. Goulburn would be a very conservative place, but obviously it wasn't, because there were these women here who were basically arguing the same thing, the right to vote.
Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century, agriculture was the main driver for life in the Goulburn district. Not just the sheep industry that the district is now best known for, wheat was grown extensively, along with maize, barley, oats, potatoes and fruit trees. In the early 1840s, poppies were grown for opium seeds. Tobacco was another crop, especially on the Veterans Flats at Turana, and this is where discharged soldiers were rewarded with small farms of 40 hectares. Wheat was so dominant that the Goulburn district at one stage was described as the granary of the state. Like many towns, Goulburn had its own flour mills, such as William Connolly's 3-storey Argyle flour mill in Sloane Street. But in 1906, Connolly relocated the flour mill further along Sloane Street when he bought Goulburn's first public baths. Built in 1892 to a design by renowned architect E.C. Manfred, the baths closed after just 14 years, drowning in debt. The flour mill continued to operate until the 1970s. Now preserved under a heritage listing, the baths are said to be still there, under the floorboards. Also going under at this time was Goulburn's wheat industry. From the 1890s, it was hit by the Depression, bank failures, together with access to better wheatlands to the west. With high prices for wool, the small wheat farms were absorbed into large sheep properties. The Goulburn district had been identified from the very beginning as ideally suited for sheep. Governor Darling referred to the abundance and goodness of natural grasses and the favourable nature of the climate for the production of wool. But in those early colonial days, sheep management was poor. As numbers increased, diseases caused heavy losses, especially when the sheep were confined to paddocks. For a time, Goulburn was not considered healthy sheep country. It took an Act of Parliament in 1866 to bring about widespread change to enforce healthy grazing practices. Goulburn became a major centre for wool sales. Brokers each had their own wool store housing vast quantities of fleece, and world record prices were set. Today, the importance of the wool industry in Goulburn, past and present, is hard to miss. Rambo, a merino sheep 15 metres high, 18 metres long and weighing 97 tonnes, welcomes visitors to the city and tells the story of the wool industry. Although agriculture was the key to the district's development, in 1851 the land was about to turn the fortunes of the town and the town's people upside down. Gold. From Bathurst to Bendigo, Braidwood, Shoalhaven, the rush was on. For Goulburn shopkeepers, it was a bonanza at first. Diggers flocked into the town, buying picks and pans, crowbars and cradles, everything they needed to head to the gold fields. The price of bread went from a penny a loaf to 17 pence in just 12 months. Gold was being found everywhere but Goulburn, despite a reward of £1,000 by local shopkeepers. The gold rush that started so well for Goulburn soon turned into a disaster as local men packed up their horses and drays and headed out to the goldfields by the hundreds. According to one account, the once busy, bustling town was reduced to a hitherto unknown state of quietness. Shops are lacking customers, some are closed, men are scarce, husbands have left wives, servants quitted their employment. Gold, it was said, was sudden death for Goulburn in the 1860s. But the gold rush meant easy pickings for some, bushrangers. In the Goulburn district, Frank Gardner, Ben Hall, Johnny Gilbert and John Dunn were among the most notorious, stealing gold and money from townsfolk and travellers. In January 1865, Hall, Gilbert and Dunn held up Kimberley's Inn at Collector, where Dunn shot dead Constable Samuel Nelson in front of his two sons. But 11 days later, these four young lads, the Faithful brothers from Springfield Station south of Goulburn, literally gave them a run for their money when the bushrangers tried to hold them up.
Yeah, the Bushran Gang was Ben Hall's gang. They were the most feared gang in the colony or in the entire British Empire. They had a massive price on their heads, and they were robbing coaches about a mile up on the hill when they saw a covered wagon. It was called a brake. It was like a modern station wagon, I suppose, drawn by four horses with the teenage Faithful boys inside.
The wagon was like a magnet to the bushrangers, but it didn't go to plan, especially for Johnny Gilbert.
Well, Gilbert on his racehorse was a bit of a show-off, and he used to like to fire both his revolvers at the same time, one in each hand. At the critical moment, his horse reared up whilst he was firing and he shot his own horse in the back of the head. So he had to take cover behind a fence post, so there were a couple of bullet holes in that fence post.
The bushrangers had 6 guns, 2 or 3 each. The boys had only a sporting rifle. It's said that 94 bullets were exchanged. By the time they escaped to their home, they had only 1 bullet left, but they'd beaten off Ben Hall, Johnny Gilbert and John Dunn.
So as a result of fighting off the most feared bushranging gang in that period in history, the boys were awarded a gold medal by a government, and it was very embarrassing for the bushrangers to be beaten by 4 schoolboys.
Bushrangers particularly targeted the mail coaches coming from Sydney through Goulburn, so much so that one letter writer wrote on the envelope, "Messrs Hall, Gilbert and Co, let this pass, nothing of value inside." The parents of students at historic Goulburn Gang, once a boarding school, cleverly devised a more secure approach.
The schoolmaster's diaries record that when the students' parents paid the fees for the school, they'd said the practice was to send the currency notes through the mail cut in half. They'd send half on one day and the other half on another mail, so that, of course, that was a way of having security, because when you got the 2 pieces, you had your entire sum of money.
Before its days as a private school and later a private home, Goulburn Gang was originally a pub, and Ben Hall was among its clientele, although not a paying customer.
Ben Hall and his gang, they came into the building in 1859, helped themselves to food and drink, and then left without paying, of course, which was to be expected. The police came. They, of course, the bushrangers had left at that stage, and Mrs. Thomas, the publican's wife, rather sensibly, I suspect, for the time, sent the police off in the wrong direction. And the story has it that Ben Hall came back a few days later and pretended to rob Charlie Thomas, the publican, but in effect what he was doing was giving him a few sovereigns because of what his wife had done in terms of misdirecting the police after the gang had been here.
Some bushrangers, it appears, had a sense of honour. The notorious Clark brothers held up the Goulburn mail coach and robbed all of the passengers, except the Presbyterian minister, the Reverend John Dunmore Lang, whose money they declined to touch. By 1859, Goulburn was growing up, officially designated a municipality, and just 4 years later it became a city, sort of. Queen Victoria issued royal letters of patent on March 14, 1863, proclaiming it a city. But this was purely to meet the requirements of the Church of England, so that it could establish the Diocese of Goulburn and St Saviour's Church as a cathedral. It had no authority in civil law, only church law. But that changed 25 years later. On the 20th of March 1885, the newly passed Crown Lands Act enabled the state government to declare officially and unequivocally the city of Goulburn, the only city to be declared a city twice, first by an act of God and later by an act of Parliament. But what really set Goulburn on its way to becoming a city of substance was the railway. Locals started agitating for the railway to be extended to Goulburn as early as 1846. It would mean produce that would take days or weeks by bullock teams could reach Sydney in hours by train. The first sod for the railway, the Sydney to Parramatta line, was turned in 1850. 19 years later, on the 27th of May 1869, the first passenger train on the Great Southern Railway arrived in Goulburn. The Sydney Morning Herald reported a public holiday had been declared and an immense influx of visitors from all parts of the country for miles around. It proclaimed a bright future for the southern capital, now that it has been united to Sydney with iron bands. The railway will bring to the doors of its traders the markets of the world. Among the many dignitaries on board the first train were the New South Wales Governor, Lord Belmore, and Lady Belmore. Lady Belmore was invited to plant an oak cutting in Market Square. Goulburn Municipal Council twice refused to contribute to the cost of the opening, but agreed to pay for the oak cutting and a suitable barrow and spade. Now, more than 150 years later, the oak tree still stands in Belmore Park, which was renamed in her honour. For many decades, the railway was one of Goulburn's biggest employers, no longer. But the railway precinct is one of the city's most important historical treasures. The whole of the rail centre is listed on the state government's Heritage Register because it is integral to the history and identity of a town which has relied to a great extent on the railways for its growth and development. It's the most comprehensive group of railway buildings outside Sydney. Its historic value, remembered and celebrated, is not only in the architecture but in the complex as a whole. But this is where history is being brought back to life, the roundhouse. No longer needed to service and turn around trains, it's now home to the Goulburn Rail Heritage Centre and the Loco Roundhouse Preservation Society. But this important part of Goulburn's history literally came within a day of being demolished by the state government.
The man charged with responsibility, he arrived in Goulburn on a Monday and he went to the Workers' Club on the Monday evening and he asked two pertinent questions. Does anybody here know anybody who can do a demolition? And the second question was, are there any railwaymen here? They had a bit of a discussion of when they found out the thing was going to be demolished on a Tuesday morning. Philip Fowler and a number of other enginemen and local enthusiasts approached the council, the Goulburn Council, and convinced them that they should have applied to the New South Wales government for a heritage listing on the property. And the government said, well, you've got it until Friday of this week. Fortuitously, by the Friday, the government had decreed that yes, this is a heritage site and there was no further demolition.
Not only was the roundhouse saved, dozens of engines, carriages and wagons and even cranes are now being restored to keep alive the history of Goulburn's and Australia's rail heritage.
We do a lot of, with some restoration going on of steam locomotives. This one here in particular, 2008, it came down full of rust and it had been sitting out at Thirlmere in the weather for 13 years. We begged and pleaded with the authorities, and they gave it to us. We've got a former prison van that was used in the early days. That's privately owned by one of our members. The main current activity is with the former Southern Aurora carriages. One of our members has 19 all up. He needs to make a train. They're being progressively restored here, and we've got people restoring carriages, and the Southern Aurora carriage will be quite a good thing.
These days only a handful of staff are required to literally keep the trains on track. But in its heyday, the Goulburn Railway provided a major economic injection for the district, directly as one of the city's biggest employer for many decades, employing hundreds of drivers, firemen, engineers, cleaners and station staff. The railway also led to Goulburn becoming a major education centre, predominantly boarding schools, but also smaller educational institutions. Among them Bushran Gang, and in on the road to the Araluen goldfields it was bought by Harborne Belcher, a classics teacher from Trinity College Dublin, as a family home and private boarding school for sons of gentlemen.
He basically created an English public school here, teaching all of the subjects which would normally be taught in that environment. Big emphasis on sport, on cricket. He was a very keen cricketer. And I think it filled a niche in the educational landscape, if you like, because public schools were set up in 1868, but there was nothing which really provided a form of education which took you through to university level, which he did here.
The school catered for a relatively small number of students, maximum of 30, but among them future leaders in military, sport and industry.
Yes, the Chevelle brothers were here. Harry Chevelle went on to become the General Officer Commanding of the Australian Light Horse. You had John Peter Russell, the Impressionist painter, a famous Australian painter. Hugh Hayman Massey, a Test cricketer, and of course the three Mort boys from down on the south coast. They went on to set up a major woolbroking business, which later became Goldsborough Mort.
Mandelson's Hotel, which hosted dignitaries and meetings that formed an integral part of Goulburn's history for 180 years, was for a time in the 1870s the Goulburn High School. At various times from 1839, churches established schools in the Goulburn district, predominantly Roman Catholic, Church of England, as well as Presbyterian, Methodist and Baptists. For many, though, the crunch came when the state government passed the Public Instruction Act in 1880, abolishing state aid to denominational schools. There would be echoes 80 years later when Goulburn was at the centre of a national education crisis over government support for denominational schools. This was the state aid crisis. It began simply enough. St Bridget's Primary School, cash-strapped, called on the state government to fund 3 extra toilets because the school had no funds. The government refused. Parents of all 6 Catholic schools were up in arms, calling a strike, sending 2,000 students to the public schools.
And in those days, difference of religion was so important. There were families split because someone married into the wrong religion. And that's such an important thing in that history that people today just don't realise.
Ray Williams, one of Goulburn's longest-serving and most respected journalists, recalls it was the toughest story he covered in more than half a century of reporting.
I had this strong feeling I didn't like the idea of children being divided. Doesn't matter what the religion was or anything like that, or what the reason was. I didn't like the idea of them going separately because I felt that it was not the right thing for young people to be told you are different for whatever reason.
For once in his 64-year career in the media, Ray Williams says it was impossible to be impartial.
How could you be impartial on an issue like that? Here's me trying to be impartial and everybody else is not. And yet I was trying to walk the centre. How can you walk a centre line on something as divisive as that?
The strike lasted only a week, but state aid went on to become a major issue in the upcoming federal election. And a year later, a commitment from the new federal government to provide funding for science blocks in state and private schools alike. Goulburn has an abundance of richness in its historic buildings, homes and monuments. But there is no structure in Goulburn more recognisable, more dominant and more evocative than this. The War Memorial, perched high over the city on Rocky Hill. The stone and concrete tower, almost 20 metres high, was funded by public subscription as a lasting tribute to the men and women of the Goulburn district who served in the First World War. Throughout the city, the names of men and women who served in conflicts throughout the world are recorded and preserved for all time.
Goulburn's had a long history of being patriotic or enlisting for adventure to get out of a tedious job or just be with their mates because their mates went. And it's important that their service be remembered because they were all volunteers.
In Belmore Park, this memorial records the names of men and for the first time women of the Goulburn district who served in the Army, Navy, Air Force and Merchant Marine in conflicts from the Second World War, Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Borneo-Malayan Emergency and Indonesian confrontation. Rod McLean, a former Army reservist, was responsible for the creation of the Goulburn Mulwaree Honour Roll.
It started when I lost my job because of medical reasons. I started doing the honour roll of Goulburn's service during the military and those who didn't come home, finding out where they were when they were killed. And from there, I told a man I was doing it, and he said, well, I might get you to look up my grandfather and uncle and father for me. So I did that, and I found out that there wasn't a roll here for the Second World War. And so I decided to take it on my shoulders and said, right, I'm going to get one done.
It took 3.5 years to find all of the names, some 3,000. Further searches and records have discovered another 100 names, and space has been left for them and others who may come to light. What makes this memorial even more special is that, like the Rocky Hill War Memorial, it was funded through public subscription.
I had one woman come up, a war widow, and she had tears in her eyes and she gave me $5 because she said that's all I can afford. And that was the attitude of the majority of the Goulburn people. So it made it a really community memorial.
For those Goulburn district servicemen and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice, there's a special tribute. At Mulwaree High School, an avenue of trees, one for each of the servicemen and women from the Goulburn district who died as a result of active service. More than 300 in World War I, 81 men and 1 woman in World War II, and 6 men in the Vietnam War.
So we've planted trees for those people. Many of the trees have brass, or in fact most of the trees have brass plaques under them, detailing their service record. And the students at the school will come during their history lessons, will come down and adopt a soldier, often a relative if it's possible.
It started when former teacher Bill Needham included a copy of a neighbour's war diary in the school library. Now, a purpose-built museum on the school ground houses one of Australia's biggest school-based military museums. Thousands of pieces of memorabilia have been donated or acquired, most from the Goulburn district, along with donations from all over Australia, Britain, France and Turkey. The museum records, preserves and commemorates the stories of servicemen and women, the stories of the wars they fought in. The Avenue of Trees is a living and poignant extension to the museum.
We have people who come and do a bit of gardening around the tree in the plaque and perhaps leave a posy of flowers on their son. One lady comes on her son's birthday. I think they really appreciate that. It's a very common comment we get. I'm so glad we've got somewhere in town, somewhere there's a native Australian tree that we can come and visit, and it's a living reminder of someone we've lost.
Just below the Rocky Hill War Memorial Tower, the latest commemoration of Goulburn's war service, the newly opened museum. Along with artefacts and memorabilia from the battlefields, it also tells the story of Goulburn's part in training troops going to the First and Second World Wars. During the First World War, 4,500 troops passed through training camps in 17 months. 4 regiments of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade encamped at Tirana in February 1914. The following year, a training camp was established in the old showground, where Goulburn High School now stands. This is where the famous Men from Snowy River recruitment march ended, a 220-mile journey from Dalgety near the Victorian border. And at Lake Bathurst, far less conspicuous, and deliberately so, a stark reminder of the Second World War. Dug into the hillside, a secret storage facility of 4 underground concrete reinforced storage tanks, capable of holding 4 million litres of fuel. It was one of 32 emergency fuel stores constructed in secret locations during the Second World War by the American and Australian Air Forces. Storage tanks that still remain, cleaned out, and potentially still usable if required. At the end of the First World War, Goulburn, like so many centres, had a new battle on its hands: the Spanish flu, the 1918-19 pneumonic influenza brought home by soldiers returning from the Great War in Europe. Goulburn was officially declared infected from the 24th of April to the 6th of June 1919. The whole of Goulburn Hospital was set aside for pneumonic influenza patients. At the town hall, more than 3,000 people were inoculated within 4 days. Face masks were compulsory for anyone attending race meetings and picture theatres, along with strict quarantining.
If you lived in a house where someone thought you were sick, you were quarantined for up to 12 days. They put a little flag or a little sign on your gate or your front door, and nurses would come and visit. The Red Cross and local volunteers would come and give you food or take care of your children and that kind of thing. It was a real community spirit in that time, I guess, which was probably a flow through from the war of that whole community volunteering.
In all, 42 people died in Goulburn, mainly men in the 25 to 42 age bracket, the main income earners. Goulburn's General Cemetery still tells the grim story. Joseph Stevenson lost his wife, daughter and son to the pneumonic influenza pandemic. The war had taken its toll on Goulburn. The pandemic extended the suffering of local families for years to come.
Parents lost sons in the war, and then daughters and wives and husbands to the Spanish flu. You know, it was a compounded problem, and it was a very sad time for a lot of people. You just have to go through the cemetery records for that time, and it's just, you know, parents and children, and it's just awful.
Throughout the past 200 years, Goulburn's fortunes have fluctuated wildly. There have been good times and bad. Nature's cycle of droughts, the rise and fall of agriculture prices, recessions and depressions, industries flourishing and failing. In its early days, Goulburn was the 3rd largest city in New South Wales. Now there are 19 cities with greater populations. In 1956, there was a prediction that Goulburn would have a population of 75,000, but that didn't count on Canberra emerging into the city it is today. Goulburn's population is now stabilised and slowly growing again, building on its strengths. Just 2 hours from Sydney and 1 hour from Canberra, accessibility, livability and affordability are the new driving forces.
Well, I think our next good times is just coming over the hill. The situation is now changing, and all of that accessibility, that connectivity is what's now driving the latest wave of growth in our community. Progression from the metropolitan area, from the Highlands and from the ACTs.
But with at least 60 buildings, homes, churches and properties on state and national heritage registers, the past will always be an important part of its future.
If you were to do a survey down the street today of visitors to our community, most of them would say that they've come to admire the many old structures, buildings and sites that we have of historical significance in our community, and the fact is they've been retained as a tourism, a source for tourism, as an attraction for tourism, and we do. So the history will play, in that respect, an important role into the future.
Goulburn, the first inland city, Queen City of the South, titles that have become clichés, but its history and heritage will always be part of the Goulburn story.